The 2025 Bills are looking like they are going to have a reasonable chance to be Super Bowl contenders. But what does it look like going forward? We're going to take a quick look at 2026 offseason today on the Wandering Buffalo podcast.
You're now listening to the Wandering Buffalo podcast with your host, Justin Goddard.
Bills Mafia, welcome into another episode of the Wandering Buffalo podcast, a show on the Buffalo Fanbase Podcast Network. My name is Justin, and I am your host today. And just off the top here, I want to give y'all an apology here for a little bit of an unexpected hiatus from the show. Still had every intention of the show coming out, but was just kind of a perfect storm of how everything shook out over the last couple weeks with my sister-in-law in town, my brother and his family in town for a visit, my brother-in-law having closed on a house and helping him move and with the first couple projects, and things just kind of went sideways for a couple weeks, but we're back with you today. And today we are talking about looking forward to the 2026 off season for the Bills, and specifically starting with taking a look at contracts. And I know it's super early to be doing this, but I do think that some of these contracts that we're going to talk about today are going to play a role in, roster decisions that are made this year. If you see maybe like a trade of a player that you weren't expecting, can kind of line it up with, okay, they were going to be a free agent next year anyways, kind of getting ahead of it. And I think most importantly for me, it's just kind of fun to look ahead a little bit of, yeah, we have a super talented roster this year. And for me, it's looking at where new holes will possibly be created. It's kind of the first iteration of what would we expect in the draft next year? What kind of big name players might we see? Where are we going to have to improve the team again? And this is all probably going to change very dramatically. I think as we go through this list of players, there's a good handful of players on this list that may seem like nothing burgers right now, but as we move through this 2025 off season and, move into getting into the regular season, I think some of these guys that we might not have big concerns with right now could end up being players that are whatever priority players to re-sign, maybe players that would leave in free agency next off season, and all of a sudden we're upset about it when at this time of year right now we'd be like, okay. So we're gonna start just kind of looking through with all of these different players, and we're also going to get into players that would be extension eligible after next season, whether it's, but after this season, I'm sorry, whether it's players coming off for rookie deals, players that are in the last year of their contract, things like that. So just going to start out real quick with the list of names. I will say it is an extensive list, which isn't really uncommon for any NFL team. There's also a good handful of players in here that we know how Brandon Beane loves his 1-year deals, and there's going to be a handful of 1-year deals this year that are just kind of mercenaries for the year and will be replaced by a different 1-year deal next year. So we'll get into all that. Just going to run through the list of names and then, give kind of my thoughts on some of the more marquee names. So players in the last year of their contract right now be Connor McGovern, Daquan Jones, Joey Bosa, AJ Epinesa, Larry Ogunjobi, Matt Milano, David Edwards, James Cook, Mitchell Trubisky, Balen Spector, Cam Lewis, Trey White, Elijah Moore, Mike White, Damar Hamlin, Reggie Gilliam, Jamarcus Ingram, Dane Jackson, Derek Forrest, Shaq Thompson, LaVisca Chenault, Darrington Evans, Kendrick Green, KJ Hamler, Christian Wilkerson, both punters Brad Robbins and Jake Camarda, Jalen Virgil, Alec Anderson, Shane Buechele, Brian Vandemark, Casey Rogers, and Marcus Harris. And just gonna kind of circle back on some of the names that I think are kind of worth talking about here. And that would start with Connor McGovern for me, which I think is an interesting case right now because I feel like I've been expecting a Connor McGovern extension. And I know that he was on Cover One talking about this upcoming contract and how he took less to be in Buffalo because it felt like the best opportunity for him. But basically, he's not taking any discounts on this next contract. And I think this is interesting, just kind of put up next to David Edwards also being a player that was on this list. Osiris Torrance being a guy that's going to be, in the next part of this show as extension eligible next year. And just kind of the idea that we've been rocking out with this best offensive line that we've put in front of Josh Allen. We've had the continuity, we've had year over year success, and that coupled with kind of just the depth that we've been creating at this position. So I could see any number of things happening here, anywhere from, McGovern, Edwards, and Osiris Torrance all get extended, and we just keep this group going till we could conceivably see 2-3 new players on the interior here. We have all of the top 9 offensive linemen from last year returning. And this part of the conversation is where we get into, like, are there some trade candidates here? Is David Edwards a guy that they might feel comfortable moving? If you're not going to be extending McGovern, are you letting him play out this year and possibly letting him walk? There's a lot going on here, but then you look at the depth behind with Van Pran Granger and Alec Anderson, who's been around, Tyler Grable. You have a lot of youth in the tunnel for this one. I still kind of predictively would like to see a McGovern extension. I guess that's not so much predictive. That's more what I would want. I think predictively this one's difficult because we haven't seen a lot of Van Pran Granger in actual game form, but a guy that comes from college pedigree, he's a draft pick of the Bills. When we did see him in preseason, I liked what we saw, but we don't really know where the organization coaching staff feels about some of these players that we haven't seen a ton. And maybe they're super high on Van Pran Granger right now, and that's why we're not in a rush to get a McGovern extension done. But I think that one's the whole really interior of the offensive line is going to be interesting beyond 2025. Daquan Jones on the list. I think this one's pretty simple. I think there's a chance that he's kind of a surprise cut candidate for this season. But, 2 years ago, absolutely awesome, electric, game-changing play from Daquan Jones. He has the injury, gets an extension from the Bills the last offseason and just hasn't really looked as explosive. I think with the investments that were made in the defensive tackle room, he really still remains the only true like one technique on this team. But I think that this would probably be a pretty straightforward. He's not on the team in 2026. Again, that could change if he's back to that form we saw, maybe some more limited reps, and all of a sudden he's a guy you want to keep around again. Joey Bosa, this one for me, I I have a hard time seeing him in Buffalo past this season. Again, you have some investments made at the position with Groot getting an extension. You drafted Javon Solomon. You just drafted Landon Jackson. And I think this Bosa situation kind of goes one of two ways. And the first being the injury bug rears its head again. And, he's not really able to stay on the field and be super effective. And you wouldn't want to invest in that beyond this season if that shows up. I think the other option is he's able to be healthy. The Bills are able to use him on a lower snap count in a rotation. He has an absolutely stellar year, and somebody's giving a defensive end on the other side of 30, one of these, you know, 4 years, 120, $150 million contracts, something like that. And I don't think the Bills are going to have the appetite for that. And this will be a lot more difficult to say if he does go out and, has a monster 13 sack season, something like that. But defensive end with an injury history on the other side of 30. I know we're still licking our wounds from the Von Miller situation. Uh, I just don't see that being the investment that Brandon Beane is willing to make. And hopefully, you're going into year 2 of Landon Jackson and you feel good about what you have there. And that's an easy one to say, you know, thanks for your services, Bosa. We're going to let somebody else give you that big old fat contract. Sticking with the defensive end group, AJ Epinesa. I think this is a situation that we could see play out in this offseason. I think when you look at just the numbers game of defensive linemen, that could realistically make the roster this year and be able to make an impact, and kind of coupling that with some young guys that you're hoping take a step. I think AJ Epinesa presents an opportunity for cap savings here. I can see this being a situation where he does make the initial roster with the Ogunjobi and Hoyt suspensions, and then maybe becomes trade bait as you're kind of moving through the first few weeks of the season. You're seeing how some of these younger guys are playing. But he's a player that, he's been a fine depth rotation type player. I think that for the role that he fills, you're hoping that some of these younger guys that you've invested in are able to take on that type of role, if not exceed it. And, you just kind of reset the money there. I think he would have some level of trade value from a team out there that maybe thinks that he could have a bit more on his plate. But, barring some real breakout through training camp, AJ Epinesa, a player that I don't think is likely to be on the 2026 roster. Moving into Larry Ogunjobi, I think this one is probably pretty straightforward for me as well. Uh, I think being on a 1-year deal with the investments that we just made through the draft in TJ Sanders and Deion Walker and Dwayne Carter last year, I just kind of see this as one of those Brandon Bean 1-year deal specials. There could be a chance that he, really finds his way in the system and you don't want to let him walk next year. But I think with that 6-game suspension, you really have kind of an uphill climb there to really showcase and put together this great season that would like demand that you were brought back next year. Like I said, again with the draft picks that they made this year and this concerted effort to improve the defensive line, I think it's going to be thanks for the year, Larry, and we're going to see a similar type 1-year deal when we're talking about this next offseason. David Edwards, we kind of already touched on here in the McGovern conversation. A very similar situation to I don't see a path to bringing back all three of McGovern, Edwards, and Torrance on deals. I think Edwards is also a sneaky trade candidate. If you feel you're feeling good about this depth that you have across the offensive line, I think you got guys like Tylen Grable that looked awesome last preseason. You have Alec Anderson, who's been around filling that jumbo role. I think you have a lot of bodies here that you could feel good about, kind of freeing up a spot. And it's also, to a lesser extent, it's great to have young players in the pipeline, but you also don't want them to just be there as depth forever. You want to get these guys a chance to play as well. So David Edwards is one that I don't really know what to do right now. I think there's a case for why would you want to, mess with this offensive line that you've had going here. To we feel really good about some of these young guys, maybe even feel like one of them might be an upgrade in this moment, and you got a contract decision to make anyways, so let's kind of get ahead of that now. So we'll see what happens there. Matt Milano, we know that he, restructured his contract, kind of take a pay cut to make him a free agent after this season. I think this one's going to be really hard for me to. It's going to be hard for me to ever say that Milano won't be making the team, but I think there is kind of. I don't want to say the writing's on the wall, but the signs are pointing towards maybe he's not going to be here next season, and it sucks because he's one of those players that it's just had his career kind of ruined by injuries, and especially over the last 2-3 years, it's like we get all excited for him to come back, and he's back for a few weeks and looking right, and then deals with another injury, and these are like long timetable injuries. I think that Dorian Williams has shown a lot of development, and maybe you feel good about him being a Milano replacement going forward. I think it's probably going to be something where Milano hits free agency and he either gets a nice size deal from another team that you don't really feel good about beating that offer, or, you know, maybe another injury season happens and there's not a lot of money out there and the Bills are able to keep him around maybe in like a reduced role. But I think that's going to be, I think the way that this contract situation's happened, that he kind of helped the Bills and helped himself by being able to become a free agent after the season. I don't think the signs are pointing towards him being back. James Cook, I think we've talked enough about Cook. uh, Obviously extension eligible this year. We'll see what happens there. I think this is going to become. What do you prioritize, having more of the line in front of James Cook that helps him be successful, or James Cook himself? And we'll see. Like I said, we've talked enough about that situation. Mitchell Trubisky, and maybe he'll be back, maybe he won't. I'm not concerned with the backup quarterback situation. I think with what we have right now, if Josh Allen goes down, you're in trouble either way. Bill Inspector, a guy that I think might have a tough time making the roster this year. I think he's kind of been fortunate that we haven't done much to retool the linebacker room this year. He's shown some ability when he's able to be on the field, but it's almost never. I mean, he's been in a depth role, and even when, some starters go down, he either has gotten injured pretty early into replacing that starter or already wasn't available because he's dealing with practice injuries. I don't really see a path where you've seen enough out of him that you're willing to keep kind of rolling the dice there. Next two I'll kind of lumped together here in Cam Lewis and Trey White. I think these two are gonna really. I think we'll probably know the answer to these ones before the season even starts, and that's going to depend on what some of these rookies look like in Max Hairston and Dorian Strong and Jordan Hancock. And, I think there's a range of outcomes for kind of both of these guys for Trey White to start opposite of Christian Benford, for Cam Lewis to kind of continue in his, first guy off the bench kind of rotation role player piece role that he's had. I think both of those guys could have that type of role all the way to not even making the roster this year. And for Trey White, I think it's more likely that we would see him brought back. I think for Cam Lewis, your hopes is that everything he gives you can get from Jordan Hancock on a cost control rookie deal with a higher upside, and you get to control that contract for a few years. For Trey White, I think he's kind of open to and acknowledging where he's at in his career, in that he's willing to kind of take on this mentor role. We talk about this with a lot of guys. I could see a reasonable path to Trey White being around the Bills as, some sort of player coach capacity. We kind of saw it with Micah Hyde last year on the practice squad. I think Trey White's a guy that really loves Buffalo, feels like home to him, and I think he could stick around the organization in some fashion, whether it's, being a cornerback for, and he's willing to take, less money to finish out his career in Buffalo. Elijah Moore, again, one that we could see this kind of play out before the season even starts. He did get, a decent amount of guaranteed money. I don't think that makes him a roster lock, but I think just watching how this plays out in training camp, I think there's a pretty obvious perceived top 5 at receiver, and I would put him in that category. But I think he has a huge range of outcomes too of, he could really blossom with Josh Allen and really get his career back on track to some of these other guys are more consistently making plays. I think you have a bit of redundancy with Curtis Samuel and Elijah Moore in different ways, but some redundancy. They both have, 2025 cap implications, so I think they're both kind of tough players to cut. We'll have to see how that shakes out. I would put this one as Elijah Moore having a better season than a lot of people think, and him getting an extension with the Bills. I like his skill set. I think Josh Allen throws to guys with this type of skill set really well, and I think he's I'm very excited for Elijah Moore being on this roster. So I think that's a guy to look out for. That's one that I think would be here beyond 2025. Mike White goes into the quarterback conversation. I'm not overly impressed. I'm not scared to lose either of these backup quarterbacks. DeMar Hamlin, interesting one, also has, a decent amount of guaranteed money this year. I think it's going to kind of depend on how it shakes out. And we'll kind of do a big grouping here of DeMar Hamlin, Jamarcus Ingram, Dane Jackson, Derek Forrest, all on this list of players that are going to be up after this year. And I think kind of that whole secondary is going to really depend on what you're seeing out of these young players. I think that Derek Forrest is a guy that I'm super excited for. I really hope that he's able to make the roster and stick around. There's still going to be some finding their way. You're moving on from Micah Hyde and Jordan Poyer. You don't really expect that to be fixed overnight. But in this next segment, we'll get into, you're going to have decisions to make with Taylor Rapp. What kind of steps do you see from Cole Bishop? I think Derek Forrest is a guy that I'm really excited about. Damar Hamlin, I'm fine with being in the building. I think he gives you a better floor than a lot of people give him credit for. And Jamarcus Ingram's been an integral player on special teams. Dane Jackson can give you that as well. We talked about this a bit when we did kind of our first 53-man roster projection. It's kind of where are you getting those special teams contributions. So I feel like one or two of these guys might stick around, and my guess would be Jamarcus Ingram, just based on how young he is. The contract that would be setting out to get wouldn't be huge. And I think that could be one of those new like staple special teams guys that we've had over the years in Medikevich and Saran Neal, all those players that we've talked about. I think he could become one of those types of players. Shaq Thompson on a 1-year deal. I feel like he's kind of just break glass in case of emergency guy right now. Maybe he's a little bit higher up the pecking order, but I don't see an urgency to get him back as of now. Laviska Shenault, I think, is going to have a tough chance to even stick around this year. Darrington Evans, I think an interesting enough conversation. He's been, on and off our practice squad over the last couple of years. I think he has a chance to stick around next year if, things are kind of going sideways with Cook and we're not able to get that deal done. I think he could be that big play threat element and kind of have a reduced role. You don't expect him to be 40-50% of snaps, but I think he could be an explosive element, kind of provided that you're losing that in Cook. KJ Hamler, I'm not seeing it. I feel like the opportunities have been around and he's been on the practice squad. There's been times where we needed more from the wide receiver room, and it hasn't been him. Don't see anything happening beyond this year. Jalen Virgil, I think, is a sneaky one. I think it would depend on kind of the numbers game this year or if injuries pop up at all. We've talked also about where's the special teams contribution coming from in the wide receiver room. I think you usually see that being like your wide receiver 4, wide receiver 5. And I don't see that from our top 5 this year. Bills usually like to keep 5. Maybe this is the year they keep 6. And if one of those perceived top 5 gets bumped or they keep a 6, I know there's some names out there. There's Caden Prather that we just drafted. There's Tyrell Shavers that had, I believe it was only 1 catch last year, and it was for like an 80-yard touchdown. I just think the rounded skill set of Jalen Virgil, and he, had his call-ups last year. He played on special teams last year. He was a gunner. He's a punt returner in college. I think there's a sneaky path to him making the roster, not only this year, but beyond. Alec Anderson, we talked about a little bit earlier. I think he's going to kind of be a priority re-signing, whether he takes on a bigger role or he remains in that kind of jumbo package, first guy off the bench type of depth. I think Alec Anderson is a guy that sticks around. Ryan Vandemark it'll be an interesting one. This is kind of where we got into seeing how the offensive line shakes up right now. I think if you asked me 2 years ago, Ryan Vandemark would definitely be a guy that the Bills would be looking to keep around. I don't think much has changed that I would lose interest in keeping him around, but he did kind of get leapfrogged by Tylen Grable as that swing tackle last season when he was healthy. You know, you'd be hoping for just continued development there. How many of these guys can you keep around and just as depth players versus, needing to see them play eventually? I think that will be kind of an interesting situation to keep an eye on. And then we're going to move into players who are under contract through next year. So through 2026, these would be guys that I would be starting to look at. Do you want to find a path to basically extend them now? Or are you looking to get them a contract next year? First one on the list, Dawson Knox. I think he's a guy that we can kind of be overly critical of. So we did see him have kind of a nice receiving profile early in his career. He struggled with some drops, but him and Allen definitely had this chemistry going on. I think his value to this team kind of goes understated, and his value as an inline tight end that does these blocking things to have Kincaid kind of be a guy that you can move around. I think he does still kind of pop off for these random 30-yard completions, and he only averages just over a catch a game over the course of a season. But I think the type of player that he is, the leadership component, I think all those things go into Dawson Knox getting an extension, probably returning as a Bill or retiring rather. And I think that extension can kind of mitigate some of where we're overly critical of him, and that he got this big extension and yeah, he was overpaid. But he also took a pay cut to help the team out. I think doing an extension, you could kind of move that money around, make it a more reasonable number for a tight end too, which I at this point, I don't think he's at a crazy number for tight end too. maybe a little bit high. But we're seeing this happen more and more throughout the league, and I do think the league is shifting a little bit back towards more run heavy and running backs getting paid. And to do that, you're going to start needing two valuable tight ends. I think Dawson Knox sticks around. Next on the list, Curtis Samuel. I think this is entirely to do with what happens this season. Not only for himself, but guys like Elijah Moore, Josh Palmer, who have similar contracts, or I'm sorry, similar skill sets, um, younger players that you could have stick around longer. Like I said, Curtis Samuel could be somebody that they choose to eat some money on because of some redundancy this year. We did see him kind of come alive at the end of last season. I think if he's able to make the roster this year, the impact that he's able to have is going to directly determine whether or not he's around past the season. Taylor Rapp, a guy that I think is super valuable to this defense. I think he's been one of our most consistent tacklers on defense. I think he plays with that high motor that gets him in trouble with Bills Mafia. There's been some friendly fire injuries. Personally, as frustrating as those can be, I like having a guy back there that's willing to deliver hits, looks for contacts. He's not making business decisions. And there's at least like 3-4 tackles that he made last year that were busted plays that looked like they're going to be really long touchdowns for the other team. And he's able to make the tackle to save the touchdown, and the defense makes a stand, and all of a sudden the opponent's kicking a field goal. I think he's super valuable to this defense. I think the organization loves him. I think this will be interesting to see what plays out between the addition of Derek Forrest. What role do you have in mind for Jordan Hancock? Where's Cole Bishop at? Like, all those things are going to be factors into how much do you love Taylor Rapp, and how much can you reset some money there with one of these younger guys. Lasaria Storms we already talked about with McGovern. He's extension eligible going into next season. I see him coming back, but it's not going to be a cheap deal, and I think that might affect the decisions made across the offensive line. I think one of the silver linings here is players that Bean has wanted to keep around. He is willing to do these early extensions and save himself some dollars, but the guard market is blowing up right now. It's going to be a payday, probably in the like 17 to 20 million AAV range. Dorian Williams, I think the hope here is that if Matt Milano's not back, Dorian Williams would be kind of your long-term replacement there, so I would see him coming back. Ty Johnson, I don't know how it's all going to shake out with the Bills predictively, but I absolutely love him in that RB3 third down running back role. He can have a lifetime contract for me. I love the player Ty Johnson is. Joe Andreessen, we'll see what happens throughout this season, but I think that the lack of moves made at linebacker this offseason kind of speaks to how they feel about the group that they have. And I think Andreessen started off as just like this fun Cinderella story, but they didn't really make significant investments into that room. And that tells, and it's a room that's dealt with a lot of injuries. I think that tells me that they're higher on Andreessen than we might think they are. And I would expect him to stick around. Brandon Codrington, awesome return player. Doesn't really have roles outside of that. I think, unfortunately, the hope would be somebody else can take over return duties this year, and you're not spending a, a whole roster spot on somebody you don't want to see on the field otherwise. Tyrell Shavers, like I said, receivers kind of a tough group to crack right now. And if somebody's going to do it, my sneaky guy there would be Jalen Virgil. Daquan Hardy, kind of similar to Codrington, and it appeared that he was kind of brought in as a return specialist. I actually thought he looked better playing cornerback than actually doing the return duties. Probably a guy that you can keep around on the practice squad and see what happens. And the last name I'll talk about here would be Frank Gore Jr., just because of his name, I don't think we've really gotten a chance to see much from him. I think his kind of height, weight, speed isn't super desirable for NFL running backs, but there were moments that he looked good in the preseason. I think he's somebody that could remain around as a practice squad guy, and if he can get an offer from somebody else to maybe be on an active roster, good for you, man. Go get it. But that's kind of our first look at what we're going to be dealing with this time next offseason. Drop a comment if you think I missed anybody. Comment if you think I'm way off the boat on missed the mark on somebody. Somebody that you want to see back that I wasn't really thinking would be around. Anything like that, drop a comment. As always, it's super helpful if you like, share, subscribe, tell a friend. Make sure you're subscribed so you're not missing any episodes when they're coming out. We'll have shows coming out all through the summer as we're moving closer to training camp. And then, of course, through training camp in the season. But I thank you for tuning in today, and we'll see you next week. Until then, and as always, go Bills.